There is a little recognized Senate hearing going on in the United States earlier today. It didn't get a lot of headlines in the United States, but probably should have, because the U.S. Central Commander of the U.S. European Command, General Chris Cavoli, was asked a number of questions about the war going on between Russia and Ukraine and some of the American associations with it. These comments that he made are very illuminating, both some of the things that he said and some of the things that he didn't say, as we often talked about there. And by the way, in case you're wondering, this is not my normal set. I'm actually at the airport. I'm heading back home from the United States. Hopefully, I'll be back in my regular set tomorrow. Appreciate you being with me here. But this stuff is too important. I didn't want to wait another day before we bring this to you. This was literally just hours ago. And really, the context is that General Cavoli is being asked by many of the senators from the Senate Armed Services Committee, is the situation there going acceptable? Are we kind of moving in the right direction? And what are the implications for the United States? And all of those are valid questions, things that we talk about quite a bit of the time. And in some cases, he's given some very frank answers that are very illuminating. And then some other times he's trying, you can tell he's kind of trying to put a good spin on it, trying to make it sound less bad than it is. But if you know what you're listening for, you can get the truth underneath it. And I think that that's one of the things that I'll point out here, because I don't get the feeling that General Cavoli wants to lie to anybody, but he's trying to find that balance between keeping his political masters happy and also staying true to his convictions. And we'll talk about some of that. But first of all, let's take a look at the first one here, because he was asked specifically about how good are the Russians getting, and what is the status of the Ukrainian army. And he wants to put a good spin on things, but you'll see he kind of has to be honest about it too.
As we watch the Russians, we see that their level of skill in some technical areas is very high and is evolving during the course of the war, but it's mainly isolated in specific pockets. It does not appear to be generalizable across the force, and overall the quality of their force, especially their ground force, has been decreasing throughout the conflict. On the Ukrainian side, we see sort of the opposite. We see a military that started pretty much from an almost cold start. We had been helping them before the war, but not at the scale we began to after the war, and they've evolved and developed very, very quickly.
Yeah, you may notice there that in the last part he said, they started basically from square one. He'd been helping them a little bit, but once they got in, so he's kind of caveating where the Ukrainian army was and then where it is now. And even that, he said it's kind of the opposite of the Russians. I'll get to that in just a second. But you can see that even when he's talking about the Ukrainians, he's trying to put a good spin on it. He doesn't say they're really good or that they're improving in their capability. He said that they're making progress and that they're working hard, those kinds of things, those kind of statements here. But look, you can't really hide the fact that things are going in the opposite direction from what the Ukraine side wants. And when he was trying to talk about the Russian side, he said, yeah, there has been some areas where they're good, but then I don't know why he said this, the overall capabilities going down, down, down as the force as a whole. I see absolutely no evidence of that. To the contrary, I see evidence that while there may be a few really good units and there may be a few really bad units, the overall trajectory of the entire overall force is continuing to escalate. It's continuing to get better and better and better. And we've seen that play out. It's not even hard. You see the tactical operations they're taking right now, the operational moves themselves that the Russians are going on, how they're isolating certain parts of the front, how they have switched back and forth from the incursion in the first back over to the eastern front, and now then in the northern part of the eastern front and in the southern parts are continuing to make operations. They have almost cleared out the first area in the north. They're starting to expand operations into the Sumy province. They continue to push back on really these pointless tactical operations, offensive operations by the Ukraine side into Belgorod and a couple of other places here, which produce sometimes short-term tactical gains that are always retracted later at great cost. So the Russian side keeps showing that they are making increasing capability improvements in the way they handle their people, in the way they conduct their operations, and in the success that they see on the battlefield. So just taking the emotion out of it, taking the, our side, your side concepts out of it, just looking at the map, seeing what's happened, it's pretty clear that the Russian side are performing substantially better than they did before. Like all issues, it's a human endeavor. And there are some examples, even recent examples of some bad performance and bad capabilities on the Russian side, many of which have been called out by the Russian military bloggers. And some of the other publications inside the Russian media, they call out when things are bad, and some of them have been. But when again, you're looking at the arc overall of where this is going, it's clearly force-wide improving for the Russians, but it is continuing to either degrade or to just stay similar to the same what it's been for the Ukraine armed size, except that their capacity itself and the fabric of the force itself continues to dwindle and deteriorate. He doesn't want to talk about that much and immediately ship it on to the next topic. Uh, but then you see that there is evidence that even more degradation is coming when you start looking at what should come next. And based on the track record of, say, over the last 6 months of where things have been going, you can see where they're likely to go. Especially, and I keep pointing this out because it's not something that's tangible. This is an intangible, but it's vitally important from this perspective of the soldiers. First of all, the Ukraine side, and then second on the Russian side. On the Ukraine side, when you know for sure that Donald Trump is trying to end the war as the best and fast as he can, that he has called out your president on many occasions, said that he better make a deal here or there's going to be hell to pay, and he's doing some things I don't like. Called him out in the Oval Office, et cetera, and all he wants to do is end the war. That cannot help but deteriorate your motivation to keep fighting. When you see that you've been on the losing end for since late 2022, really, or late 2023, rather, all the way through to this day. You see the Russian side keeps getting bigger and stronger. They have no shortage of ammunition, and you keep having shortage. You can't help but lower your morale and your willingness to fight. And of course, if the casualty counts keep growing and they keep grabbing guys off the street in Ukraine, you can see over and over that it is a deteriorating formula. It's not status quo. It's not maintaining. It's continuing to deteriorate. Whereas on the Russian side, the opposite is happening because their motivation is through the roof because they see that they have the upper hand. They know that they have enough troops that they can actually rotate people in and out of the forces. They had time to rest their troops. They get plenty of training out of contact before they come in. So everything is going good, and they see all the same cards, and so their motivation and morale is going higher. Those things just cannot. You can't get the status quo out of that. You can't get a frozen conflicts out of that. It's only going to continue to improve for one and be great for the other over time. So that's just the reality of where it's headed here. Now, one of the other questions that General Cavoli was asked related to the United States side. And he was asked, okay, so the U.S. has been helping the Ukraine side for all this time. We've had troops on the ground, especially the leader level inside Ukraine, working hand in glove with the Ukrainian side. How is this done? How does this work out for the United States? Have we improved ourselves?
We've learned a lot about institutional adaptation from watching both sides as well.
If we or our NATO allies had to face Russia ourselves in a conflict, because of what we learned, would we be exponentially better off today because of the lessons we've learned in the last 2.5 years?
Oh, yes, Chairman.
Okay, that's the part. That's one of the things that worries me the most about anything General Cavoli said today. I hope that he's just saying that to placate his political masters on the Hill or his seniors in uniform because he can't say anything different. I hope that's the case, and I hope it's not that he actually believes that. You see, though, that the senator does. Are we exponentially better off? Not just have we improved some because we've seen this happen, but are we exponentially better off? He said, "Oh, yes, Senator." And obviously, the senator already believed that. And after hearing this, he's probably even more convinced. So he'll probably stop looking, probably won't pay attention to it. But I can just tell you the likelihood is that he is completely wrong. Now, I haven't been in active duty since 2015. So it's been, there's a solid decade there where I've been out. All I can do is rely on what people have told me. But I also have actually parts of 3 decades experience before this in uniform be able to tell me enough that the people that are in charge now are categorically and substantively similar to the ones that have been there throughout my whole active duty time here. And I have great belief that that he thinks that we're getting stronger, but he's not aware of what he's talking about. Because I've done enough training and studying independently, as well as my formal military training and my combat experience before combat deployments, everything from high intensity tank on tank conflict all the way through to military training, counterinsurgency, et cetera, across the board. And I can tell you that combat experience is not combat experience. You think that you know one thing, but until you actually get bloody your nose in the first fight, you don't know for sure what you know and what you don't know. And I can just tell you from personal experience, I had fought in Desert Storm in a big tank on tank battle. And then over time, the Iraq and the Ukraine war, the Iraq and Afghanistan war for us kicked off, and everything turned into counterinsurgency and focus on small units, et cetera. Then subsequently, I was later in my career, I got elevated up to as a major to the second in command of an armored cavalry squadron as the division cavalry for the first armored division in Europe. And so that was around the mid 2000s, a little bit later. After the war in Iraq finally started settling down and the war in Afghanistan was kind of on a low boil, then the units, the leader said, okay, let's start focusing more on actually high end stuff. Let's get back to our core competencies here. So I have always paid attention to this. I was always thinking it was a problem that we quit focusing on our core stuff and that we spent so much time on these smaller counterinsurgency things at the expense of our capacity to actually fight and defend ourselves against a peer or near peer adversary. So I continued to study, I continued to train. I visited World War II, World War One battlefields, Civil War battlefields in the U.S., all over the world in various different spots. I mean, almost all over Europe, from one end of that all the way up to Stalingrad, what was Stalingrad in Russia at one point. And yet, when they made that switch, and they said, okay, now that I was literally the first unit that went through back into the Combat Maneuver Training Center in Europe, where they replicate all the uh, aspects of an actual war in a peacetime situation where you have to have lasers, on your tanks and on your Bradleys, machine guns, individual weapons, et cetera. So, you can't go bang, bang, I got you. No, you didn't. It actually replicates if there was actually a round fired and all that kind of stuff. So it's very, very accurate in terms of battlefield dynamic. Now you can't change the psychological machines because if a round's coming in, it's just a report on a computer, not an actual explosion that will rattle your head, et cetera. So you can't manufacture everything, but it's best you can get in peacetime. As someone who had always paid attention and was always thinking about maneuver warfare, I still found myself when we went back into the field for the first time as the unit, my thought process was very, very much slow, and I kept having to relearn things. I keep going, oh shoot, yeah, I forgot about that. Oh, that's right, yeah, this and that, and then the reaction, everything was slowed down from what I was expecting, and I was one that paid attention to those who had not been studying on their own and paying attention, or who had younger officers and enlisted guys who hadn't even had any experience of that. It was painfully slow. And we've had every opportunity in the world to train on our own, to train in garrison center before we got into that big unit situation. That's just a training situation. And I promise you that our actual combat units right now who are doing plenty of field training, it's one thing to be going through training and to read after action reports from the Ukraine side, from the Russian side, from our intelligence, and to try to put that into effect on the battlefield. But it's a radically different thing when you experience it. Because from especially what I read from World Wars One and Two, where there was heavy use of artillery like there is right now, you just cannot imagine the psychological impact and the blow that has. Or when you see your friends getting blown up left and right, you have to continue to go on with the mission. None of those things can be replicated in training. And then the speed at which this action, counteraction situation keeps developing in combat, which he did speak about a little bit to his credit in this testimony. But the concept and theory is radically different than what happened. And both Ukraine and Russia have proven it because they thought they had one level of understanding when this started. And they keep discovering how the practice is very different. And then they have to make adjustments. And then the other side adjusts to that. And then you have to add a counteraction to their action, and then vice versa. And it just never stops. And this stuff happens with light speed when you're actually in it. But it took both sides better part of a year and a half, 2 years to finally get to the point to where they could reduce that cycle of action, counteraction, et cetera. Now then, they're pretty good at it because their mind has become retooled and rewired for that speed of operations. Ours are still at ground one. We're still at where they were in February 2022. Maybe you can say a few months beyond that. But because we haven't experienced it, it's just we are so far away from thinking what we can do. So this is, I think, unsubstantiated confidence in our capacity. And he's talking about what was the word he used? Not existential. He said, has this been a significant advance from where we were? Exponential was the word he used. He said, they were exponentially better. He believes it. I'm telling you, we're not. You'll see. pray to God we don't actually have to find out in combat here. But if we do, I have a pretty good idea how that's going to turn out. Uh, One of the other things she's talking about here, this is where he may have been putting too good of a face on something, and I would have been a lot more comfortable if he had even just tried to put a lipstick on a pig situation instead of saying, yeah, the Ukraine side's getting better. Came down to the manpower issue, which is, I tell you all the time, is at the core of anything. Technology, weapon systems, ammunition amounts, even industrial capacity. All those things are important, but everything comes down to manpower. Can you function with the manpower, or do you have it, or do you not? Who has the ability to maintain the losses and to replace them and to continue to bring trained personnel in, and who doesn't? That's the side that almost always wins in an attritional war, no matter what you're talking about. When asked specifically about the Ukraine side, here's what the General Cavoli had to say.
The Ukrainians on their side have assumed very strong defensive positions, well dug in, and appear to have solved some of their manpower problems that were so acute last autumn. They've increased the pool of people available for mobilization. They've increased the pool of people available for voluntary recruitment, and they've done a good job squeezing people out of headquarters to the front.
Yeah. Okay. Look, you don't have to Google very much. You don't have to look on Telegram very much to see almost every single day tons of videos from family members and friends and whatnot capturing Ukrainian. I think they call them the TCC. I forget what that stands for in Ukrainian. Basically, the recruiting force that just grabs men off the street. I mean, fights with them, get them thrown into vans. We show those kind of videos all the time. And we've had even shown them in a lot just because there's so many and ubiquitous. We just haven't shown them. But I saw something new even this morning. The quality of people that's going to get is going to be very low. And you keep losing people who have experience. And so instead of the force keep growing in experience level, you just have to keep doing this and then this and then this, because every time somebody gets experience, they get killed and they die off, and you bring somebody else in who's not as good as the guy that was just killed. And so the quality of the force keeps dropping down. And however long they stay alive, then as soon as they die, then it goes back to zero when a new guy comes in. You see, that's just the problem when you don't have enough men. You had General Sersky not a few months ago admit that they can't force mobilize enough people to offset the monthly losses. It's a net loss every time. That has continued on. You have on the Russian side the opposite. They continue to have even more troops come in. They continue to have a more ability to train. I've seen some reports out just earlier this afternoon that there are large Russian formations outside of contact, many of which have been going through long terms of periods of training outside of combat. So then you have guys that are experienced, and then they have guys that with no experience, they come in, and then that way they're able to get a lot of confidence and training before they ever even hear the first bullets fired. It's matched with people who do have the experience of having lots of bullets fired around their head, etc. It's the best of all worlds in their combat. Ukraine has the worst of all worlds because they don't have the luxury of keeping people off. They don't even have enough uh, theater reserves to be able to plug gaps as Russia may be making an advance in one area or another. So they constantly have to keep all the front lines filled. Nobody gets to rotate back, which is also a drain mentally if you don't have time to replace. The Russians do. So they pull guys off the line. If they've been there for 6 months or so as a unit, to pull the unit off the line, bring in a new one, et cetera, and then they'll re-equip, retrain, refit. And the overall force on the Russian side, therefore, continues to strengthen and get better. We just had a few days ago where Vladimir Putin announced that they're going to recruit, not recruit, matriculate through draft 160,000 Russian men this year, which is the most they've had since 2011 in a single year. Now, that is because they are a lot of these guys that come in. They have I think it's a 1 year requirement that everybody who gets, I think it's 18 years old, they become subject to being called up, and they have to serve 1 year. And so once they serve the year, then they can get out. That's been happening here. Unlike the Ukraine side, when you get in, you either die or you stay until the war's over. The Russian sides don't do that. They continue to demobilize these troops after their 1 year and bring in new ones to on top of the recruited folks, the professional soldiers that continue to operate. They keep those guys on, not mostly, but on territorial defense issues, whatever, on the borders with Russia. What that does is it frees up other formations to fight in the Russian inside the war in Ukraine, where there's somewhere around 600,000 Russian troops, depending on what day of the week it is. Who knows what the exact number is, but it's somewhere between 600 and 700,000. Well, now then Russia has been built up because each of the last 3 years they keep adding to the number. And even though they're losing lots of men every single month, similar to what the Ukraine side is, well, not in similar numbers, but they lose people every month, of course. But the number that they bring in exceeds that, so that every year their overall force size continues to grow. They're now at about 1.5 million and apparently are heading towards 1.65 or 1.7 active army troops. So the Russian side keeps growing. Everywhere you look, you see that going on. And yet, you see that General Cavoli is saying, no, the Ukraine side has figured out their manpower issues. And one of the tales there, the tales that he had, is he said, yeah, they have learned to squeeze out from the headquarters. And so that solves the problem. That is a band-aid, folks. And let me tell you what he means by that. When he says squeeze out from the headquarters, that means they have the headquarters staffed at various levels to do the jobs that they need whether it's communications, intelligence, just administrative support, logistics, whatever. All those things are at the headquarters there to enable the troops in the front line to do their fighting. He's saying that they have been raiding those kinds of headquarters elements because they don't have enough men at the front to fight and they can't get them to recruit. Now, he's saying that they have squeezed us up to solve the manpower. That's a band-aid because now then that means that your headquarters are probably less effective. So the jobs those guys were doing there now aren't getting done. Ergo, your support to the front lines is also deteriorating. And you're sitting guys who are trained to be communications guys, administrative people in headquarters, and now you're handing them a rifle and telling them to do a good job on the front line here when that's not what they're trained for. You see where this is going. All of these are signs of units and armies that are in the death throes. It's exactly what happened to the Nazi Germany in the latter stages of World War II. The first part of 1945, they were throwing cooks into the front line, headquarters, they were squeezing out from the headquarters, the same kind of situation there. Obviously, putting old men, boys in uniform, anything they could find. Ukraine's apparently about to consider lowering the draft age even further so that they get 18-year-olds, which so far have not been tagged. And of course, many of them have been fleeing the country here in the last number of months. As it's been self-evident that that's the last cohort of people left in the Ukraine side, but they keep shrinking and they keep going smaller. Now, I think that the most meaningful thing that came out of this was not even something General Cavoli said actually on camera during the testimony, which I don't know why no one followed this up, or at least enough that I could find so far. But in his opening statements, he said this.
Russia's not just reconstituting service members, but is also replacing combat vehicles and munitions at an unprecedented pace. Russian ground forces in Ukraine have lost an estimated 3,000 tanks, 9,000 armored vehicles, 13,000 artillery systems, and over 400 air defense systems in the past year, but is on pace to replace them all. Russia has expanded its industrial production, opened new manufacturing facilities, and converted commercial production lines for military purposes. As a result, the Russian Defense Industrial Base is expected to roll out 1,500 tanks, 3,000 armored vehicles, and 200 Iskander ballistic cruise missiles this year.
And that is just astounding here that at the end, this now the fourth year, in 1 year, they're going to get 1,500 tanks, 3,000 armored personnel vehicles. And by the way, that earlier number there where it says 3,000 tanks, 9,000 armored vehicles, and 13,000 artillery systems had been destroyed or damaged. Most of those that are damaged are actually brought back into service later. So they're able to actually bring them back up to service here. So it's not as though those are catastrophic kills. Same thing on the Ukraine side, but the Russian side has a much more sophisticated capacity, much more robust and built out capacity to have those repairs and have them get back further, quicker. So the damage is less scale on the Russian side, and the recovery period is much more robust on the Russian side, whereas on the Ukraine side, as some of you may know, they actually have to ship some of those things out of Ukraine up into Poland or Romania because they just don't have the capacity. And obviously that takes a lot of time to get things back, and it makes it harder, and the distances, it's just a big mess and much more difficult to do. But what that tells you is the industrial capacity is just off the charts on the Russian side, because there was no such comment on the Ukraine side's ability to do this. In fact, There was an additional comment in that same category there. They're talking about the artillery systems alone. The Russian side by itself is making over 250,000 artillery shells per month, per month. And that dwarfs the entirety of Ukraine and all of its Western supporters combined. And that does not count what the Russians get from North Korea, which in the, I guess about an 18-month period, it was like 4 million shells on top of what the Russians make themselves. But when they can produce, they can outproduce everything the West can produce combined. That's really telling. There was an article I saw that it was reporting something out of Poland yesterday. I think the article came out and said that basically Poland produces enough artillery shells per month for 2 days of fighting at current rates. 2 days. And that's after 3 years of 3 full years. Now in the fourth year of war, they're still only producing enough artillery shells domestically to equip about 2 days worth of fighting on the front lines. Obviously, it's going to be insufficient. Russia doesn't have that problem. So everywhere you look, there is no question about where this is going. So instead of trying to give optimistic comments, instead of trying to put lipstick on a pig, I think General Cavoli and any of these other military guys owe it to the American people, owe it to the president, owe it to Ukraine for that matter, to sit there and say, hey, this is the truth. This is the hard truth. This is what's going on. There is no capacity on the Ukraine side to continue this war for much longer. You know, the situation on the ground and diplomatically, Putin, as we've been talking about, is in no hurry because they don't need a negotiated settlement. They're continuing to fight every day. They continue to make progress in the Kupiansk area, the Zaporizhia area, and the Sumy area up in the north. And as we've been talking about, there continues to be reiterated from the Ukraine side reports that there are 2 large formations of the Russians, which could come in at any one of several different points, possibly could more than 1 point or more than 2 points if they wanted to split their forces up. But if they push against any brittle points of the war here in the coming days or weeks, there's a very real possibility this could break because the fundamentals that have been exposed here, which I've shown you about, are just not good for the Ukraine side. It can't be sustained. That's the bottom line. It cannot be sustained. And inevitably, there's going to come a break. There just almost has to be, just because that's the laws of nature. That's just how things work. You can't continue whittling something down and it never break. At some point, the fabric is going to tear. We'll have to wait and see if it's going to happen. Now, there's in the final part of a few minutes I have here, I want to tell you about another thing that's related to the United States, what's going on as well. It's all over the news right now, and I hope to cover this either maybe the latter part of this week or weekend, or possibly the first part of next week. We'll definitely hit it. And that is what the issue with all these tariffs that President Trump has basically put on the entire world, friend or foe. That has some ramifications, and I'm not going to look at the full thing here, but I am going to look at how it's affecting our NATO. And earlier today, there was a comment by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who was asked a rather uncomfortable question from the audience.
Saw leaks from a signal chat of the US administration, and in there some disrespectful comments about European allies. Why are the United States still a trustworthy ally?
Absolutely they are. You've seen what President Trump himself said about Article 5, about NATO, his full commitment. We know that they have an expectation. The expectation is for the Europeans and the Canadians to spend more. And that is happening as we talk. I mean, as I said, this is probably the biggest increase in defense spending since the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. But still we need to do more. So this will be on the agenda today. So there is a clear commitment by the US, a clear expectation that we will equalize the spending here on the European side of NATO with what they are doing. Because of the Russian threat, because of the build-up in China, look what they are doing with their nuclear arms, and of course Iran and North Korea.
Yeah, but is it a clear commitment? Because the President Trump's administration, Trump himself, but even Marco Rubio here of late, Secretary of State, has said, hey, you guys here in Europe, you got to do more. We're going to probably be doing less, and you got to be stepping up here. So that's just on the diplomatic and the statement side, much less the issue on the tariff side. So we have not made an ironclad comment that this Article 5, you see Trump has been saying, hey, I want 5% GDP from everybody in European NATO. I want you guys to all step up your spending to that level here. And he has implied, and sometimes outright stated, or Article 5, we may or may not come to your help, et cetera. So for Rutte to stand there and say, oh, yeah, Oh yeah, they definitely. The United States is definitely firmly there. This is another one of those you try to put lipstick on a pig. When he was asked the question, very uncharacteristic of Garuda, he hesitated. He said, well, of course. Actually, Gary, if you want, I don't want you to pay attention to that. Normally, Ruda just immediately pops off because he's a very experienced politician. I'm going to ask Gary to rerun that clip there through the first few seconds and watch that hesitation when he first answers.
Saw leaks from a signal chat of the US administration, and in there some disrespectful comments about European allies. Why are the United States still a trustworthy ally?
Absolutely, they are. You've seen what President Trump
Okay, that's
himself.
good. You see, absolutely they are. That tells you a lot right there because how he normally reacts to questions. So he genuinely paused and then said, "Okay, well, we'll do something different here. We'll figure it out." But that tells you that it is not as ironclad as he's saying. And instead of telling the truth, instead of saying, there is some questions here, we got to figure this out. He tells a lot of people. So some people who still take politicians at their face value and at their word without checking anything, just kind of like ignore it and just say, "Okay, I guess everything's fine then." I think it's pretty clear it's not fine. But this just shows you that there is still to this day a big gap between what the Western side and the Ukraine side is on. I don't even have time to talk about the Ukrainian portion of this, but it's still just as distracted, and detached from the United States as anything else. And it's closer to the European side and farther away from the Russian side. So we are nowhere even near having an actual 30-day ceasefire, even further yet from having a diplomatic end to this. But every day that we delay, every time that we push back on these things, we get closer and closer and closer to the time when Russia seeks a military advantage on the battlefield and takes what they want. And then the time for diplomacy will be over. And then nobody gets to react. Trump can get mad at whoever he wants to, but he won't be able to change anything on the ground. Now is one of the closing window where you can actually do something to try and change the outcome or at least have an influence on it. If we keep waiting, we're going to end up just being fait accompli, and the Ukraine side is going to lose, and we're going to be left holding a very empty bag. We'll continue to be watching this for you. We'll continue to watch it because we are intimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, no matter what it is, no matter where it's at. You deserve to know the truth and make sense of your world around you. Thanks very much for watching. We'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode again of Bittersweet Guy.